I'm going to talk on labor exploitation, exclusion, and racial terrorism. I'm going to focus my comments on the state of Illinois, and I'm going to do that in two different historical periods. I'm going to talk about the period of enslavement, so I'm looking at Illinois from its founding in 1819 to 1870, the period of the Black laws, and then I'm going to focus really deep on the 50-year period from 1874 to 1924 that we know as the Second Nadir. That is to say, a dismal moment in which Black folks' advances were pushed back. Let me begin by saying I want to thank the State of Illinois African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission for your work and for inviting me to give testimony. Asante Sana. Thank you very much. So, in talking about the distinct problems that Black folk in Illinois have experienced, I want to identify two distinct problems. One is the social historical experiences of the African American worker in Illinois and more broadly in the U.S. empire. Now, the first concerns the actual lived history of Black workers, their material conditions, work relations, and agency, by which I mean resistance in the form of community building initiatives and struggle against anti-Black racial oppression. The second is historiographic. There is a bourgeois bias in the writing of African American history. The premier labor and urban historian Joe William Trotter spoke of it in a 2021 interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books. Trotter observed, quote, "When we look at the historiography of African Americans, on the writing of African American history, for many years, we tended to privilege the stories of those outstanding figures who rose to the pinnacle of success. But I felt that ordinary, everyday lives of working people were shortchanged. So my work has been about bringing the Black worker more to the forefront within African American history and using that as a way to talk about how the African American community shaped the country," unquote. Now, Trotter advocates shifting the emphasis in African American history toward a focus on the dry long soul. That's an old African American term for the ordinary, everyday folk. That is to say, the working class Black majority. Such a move refocuses African American history on the modal experience, mode as in statistics, right? Meaning that the most frequently occurred experience, the most frequent lived experience of the African American people has been as enslaved persons, sharecroppers, farm laborers, domestic servants, washerwomen, wage workers, non-industrial or industrial workers, menial laborers in the public sector, and as contemporary sub-proletarians, laboring in part-time, temporary, low-wage, ununionized, and benefitless jobs. Returning to the first problem, an analysis of Black workers' lived experience in Illinois reveals two dominant relationships. First, they shared with white workers labor exploitation. That is the hallmark of capitalism, theft, to exploit labor. Charles Wesley, a premier African-American historian, identified in 1927 what he called wage slavery, the continual exploitation of Black workers. Wesley then went on to highlight what he called special handicaps of race and color. Now, the additional burdens included what I would call super exploitation and racial terrorism. That is to say that Black male workers were generally confined to what were called, quote unquote, Negro jobs. I think 47 called them Black jobs. That is to say, lower paying, hot, dirty, and dangerous labor, and black workers, black male workers, were remunerated a third less than white workers while doing the same job. That's to say that they made 66% of what white workers made doing the same job. In the period 1874 to 1924, African American workers were often victimized by lynching and racial pogroms, or what were referred to as race riots. And I'm being very deliberate with my language. When I say racial pogroms, I mean that these are not spontaneous food riots. These are planned efforts of homicidal with perhaps the intent of committing genocide against a community of people. Black workers from 1819 to 1870. From its founding, Illinois was hostile to African Americans. The 1819 Constitution included what they called the Black Laws, which discouraged African American migration by requiring them to present, quote, freedom papers to a magistrate in order to reside in the state. Passage of the Illinois Constitution of 1848 accelerated the assault on African Americans. It prohibited quasi-free, and we say quasi-free because they were not enslaved, but they did not have basic fundamental human rights in this society. So they were quasi-free, and they were refugees. They weren't migrants, they were refugees fleeing the terror and the labor exploitation and the abuse and trauma of the South. So they came to Illinois, and the state made it illegal for Illinois enslavers to manumit, that is to say, to free an individual or a small group of people within its boundaries. These provisions were largely the product, ironically, of white workers who feared competition from black labor. In 1853, the Illinois legislature passed legislation that subjected any black person who entered the state and remained 10 days to, quote, a fine of $50. If the fine were not paid, then that person would be, quote, sold to any person who would pay the fine, unquote. Throughout the 1850s, African Americans were relegated to the most menial jobs: common laborers, domestics, cooks, boatmen, and roustabouts. A roustabout is someone who works on a ship on the river. Now, yet, throughout the state, and especially in the southern region, fear of black workers inflamed white Illinoisans. The Cairo Weekly and Delta newspaper reported that the town, Cairo, was, quote, entirely overrun by free N-words, N-word, unquote. Now, when that statement was published, Cairo's African American population was 30. The U.S. tilted on the brink of civil war in the 1850s. Fearing being replaced by black labor, white workers lashed out violently throughout the decade with the intent of driving black folks out of the state. In 1857, white folks violently attacked African Americans in Cairo and Mound City. After the outbreak of the Civil War, white supremacist Democrats regained control of the Illinois legislature. By 1862, 1,500 self-emancipated, that is to say, black folks who freed themselves, had entered and streamed into Cairo. The Democrats accused the Republicans of seeking to, quote, Africanize Illinois. They claimed, they went further, they said that the Republicans were colonizing Illinois cities with Africans. The response was that they sponsored a state convention to write a new constitution. The proposed Democratic Constitution included what they called a Negro clause that would prohibit black folk from fleeing to the state, deny them basic human rights such as the right to vote, testify in court, or hold political office. They had to pay school taxes, but their children could not attend the public schools. The new Constitution was not ratified, but the anti-black article was approved by 57% of the voters in the northern region, 90% where we are in central Illinois, and 97% in the south, in southern Illinois. However, on June 2nd, 1863, this is even worse, Illinois became one of only 5 states to ratify the Krannert Amendment. The Krannert Amendment declared, quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." So in other words, they would deny Congress the possibility of abolishing enslavement. The state of Illinois, Illinois voters voted for it. Now, black workers in Illinois in the second nadir, 1874 to 1924, this is a definitive period in the development of black folks in this state. On January 24th, 1865, in a completely partisan vote, the Illinois legislature repealed the black laws. Understand, if you just reverse the parties, this second nadir looks very much like this moment, which we call the third nadir. Despite the effort of Illinois black leaders, the legislature failed to grant African Americans basic human rights. They acquired such rights only after the 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd, 1870. By then, the black refugees fleeing the South had exploded into the state's African American population. For instance, Cairo black residents grew from 47 in 1860 to nearly 1,900 in 1870. In Chicago, it went from 1,000 black folk to more than 3,700 black folk. The white worker aristocracy, because they were indeed a privileged class, because of imperialism, because of the colonization, internal colonization of the African American nation, they were a labor aristocracy. They viewed black workers as racially inferior invaders, not as fellow U.S. citizens. Therefore, Illinois' white workers reacted hostilely and instituted measures to secure their privileged position as a labor aristocracy by excluding African American workers from unions. Excluded from labor unions by white workers, African American laborers were at the mercy of white capitalists who exploited their labor by paying them less than white workers, and white workers who violently assaulted them as strikebreakers. Super exploitation was the norm, as capitalists deliberately paid black workers less for the same job. Excluded from unions, black workers had no incentive to view the white labor aristocracy as quote-unquote union brothers. During the second nadir, 1874 to 1924, anti-black labor racial pogroms transpired in Illinois. Terrorist assaults on black workers took place in every region of the state, from Cairo to Chicago and from East St. Louis to Briarwood. The racial massacres in Pana, East St. Louis, Carterville stand out. Estimates of the number of black people killed in these labor racial pogroms range from 48 to 250, with the East St. Louis massacre accounting for, on the low end, 39, but on a more accurate number of 200 murdered African Americans. And we say 200 because the Cahokia River ran red with the blood of black bodies. 39 people don't turn a river red. The first labor terrorist incident occurred in February of 1874. 300 striking white workers at the Robert Learman mines in St. Clair County attacked 25 black workers, destroying their residence, their belongings, and, quote, driving some out of the county. The unionized white workers were demanding 4 cents a bushel. The black miners were making 3 cents a bushel. Historian Aaron Kennelly described the 1895 Spring Valley racial labor conflict as, quote, the tipping point in race relations in downstate Illinois. And then he goes on to say that the 1898 Battle of Virden can be seen as racial violence entering hyperdrive, unquote. The Battle of Virden involved a mob estimated to be between 500 and 1,500 striking white miners. Now, I know you're saying, really? Well, I can tell you this, 1893, June 3rd, Decatur, Illinois, 2,000 white folk stood in the rain from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. waiting for a mob to come from Mount Zion and lynch a black man. They stood in the rain. So yeah, these things gathered huge numbers of people. So 500 to 1,500 striking white miners and their supporters attacked a railroad, a trainload of black miners that were being imported by the Chicago Virden Coal Company. In the October 13th melee that followed, 5 black miners were killed and 7 wounded. As was often the case, racialized labor disputes sparked other forms of racial discrimination, including racial terrorism. After the Battle of Virden, animosity against black folk was so intense that in several surrounding communities, they transformed themselves into sundown towns, towns in which black folks had to be out of town before the sun went down. The Chicago Tribune noted that the white residents of Toluca, Illinois, had, quote, always held considerable antipathy against African Americans. And when the rumor spread that black workers were being, quote, imported, unquote, into the area, quote, many colored men were forced to leave town. A month after the Virden racial battle, 100 white miners from a nearby town of Toluca stormed the Marshall County Jail in Lacan, where F.W. George Stewart, accused of rape, had been smuggled for safekeeping. The mob forcibly removed him and lynched him from a tree. Stewart's lynching was one of 19 that occurred in Illinois during the Second Nadir, 1874 to 1824. Illinois is tied with Kansas as the northern state to lynch the most black folk. And let's be clear about lynching. In the decade from the 1890s, every 2.5 days, a black man, woman, or child was lynched somewhere in the United States, 97% of them in the South. Ironically, if you look at police killings of black folks at its height in the 2010s, you will find that every 36 hours, a black man, woman, or child was murdered by a police officer, very similar to lynching. So let me come to a conclusion. So, the meanings of reparations. The African American reparation movement that began before the U.S. Constitution was passed. It's a long, in fact, one can be very clear, reparations is the oldest, most consistent demand of the African American people. It is the single demand in which you have the largest percentage of black folks in agreement with. We don't agree on a lot of things, but 74 to 78% of us stand for reparations. It is the single most important demand of the African American people. When we say that the reparation movement calls for reparatory justice, we mean repair, compensation, and restitution. Repair the damages that were done. The Reverend Clarence Thomas spoke eloquently to those damages. Compensate. The person who went before me, Dr. Boyd, spoke very clear about the need for financial compensation. And now we have to talk about restitution. Restitution means to return me to my prior condition. The condition of African American people before the European slave trade, and we say the European slave trade, not the African slave trade, not the Atlantic slave trade, because the slave trade was organized and controlled by Europeans, and it was done in the interest of European capitalism. So it's the European slave trade. And so what was the condition? We were citizens of sovereign African societies. The first, the most important thing that was taken was not material. It was our right to self-determination. What we want back is our sovereignty, our right to determine our own destiny as a people. Racial terrorism, which has been the large focus of my talks today. We're talking about racial labor pogroms, and we're talking about racial massacres, and we're talking about lynching. They provide us with identifiable victims and perpetrators. We're able to identify private actors and state actors, sheriffs, marshals, deputies, governors, mayors who neglected their duty or conspired with the assailants and murderers. We can identify them. In these heinous events, African Americans were assaulted, murdered, robbed, and destroyed. They often were forced to abandon their homes. That property was taken over by the white residents. That land was stolen. Their belongings were stolen. When those mobs came through black communities, burning, pillaging, raping, and murdering, they also stole the possessions. They took the money. In these pogroms, black churches, lodges, businesses were also robbed and destroyed. This brings us to the real question. It's not about individual reparations. We constitute a nationality, a nation of people that simply does not have a state. But we are a nation of people. So what we want to talk about is collective reparations, reparations to communities and reparations to the African American people, as well as individual payments. Thank you.